a little demonstration. Hey! A scrunchie bag! Wow! It's so cool! There's all kinds of scrunchies! Let's wear it! Let's... Keep this one in mind. Take 2. Hey, another bag! Whoa, it's a baguette bag! Oh, it has all kinds of beautiful texture on the body of the bag. This is amazing. Who came up with this idea? Oh, I did. But let's wear it. Oh, it's so beautiful. I hope by now you got the point. If you have too many bags, you'll end up in an aquarium. Well, that was actually the secondary point. The main point was when you wear these types of bags, you'll usually end up seeing only the handle and the side of the bag. So this is what we're gonna concentrate on today. So I made a sewing pattern to upcycle a jeans into a bag, combined with a fabric manipulation technique called tucking. But since tucking sounds rather unsexy, I'm calling this one origami bag. But don't applaud yet, this is gotta be a challenge. It took me 3 different softwares and a lot of freaking frustrating hours to achieve this chopped up pattern in the actual exact correct size, so that you can easily and conveniently print this on your home printer. So please do me a favor and print it to the correct size. And that usually means you have to change the settings, because it's often set to 90% or scale to fit paper, and then the pattern will not be correct anymore. Probably have to change the settings to 100% or actual size before printing. I divided it into separate files to make it a bit easier to understand what belongs together. Each file contains all the papers that have to be stick together. They can only be stick together one way. You can screenshot or refer to the sewing guide. Just like this, right?
Yes.
That was a test. Look at the image. All the pages of the file have to fit together. So then there's only one way. Easiest will be to just snip off the border on one paper. And you can leave the other side on. That way you can really quite easily line it up and stick it together. And then put some weight. Sorry, didn't mean to say your fat Carlos. Anything to hold it in place, to stick it together as straight as possible with transparent tape. And all the lines match up perfectly. Then level 1 completed. Level 2, another puzzle, another puzzle, another puzzle. Everyone gets a puzzle. So I made the pattern in a way that it should kind of get out of a jeans, kind of. Or in my case, kinda not. Just a little measly centimeter too small. Who would have guessed? Make your life a little easier, get it out of a little bit of a bigger jean. So probably your best bet is a jeans bigger than a size 36 or US size 4. If you don't want to have to seam rip the hems out to win some extra space. Or any other sort of canvas or fabric that you already own. The more attentive viewer under you might have seen that there is a lot of pass marks, like, oh no. Yes, we need to make a little cut at every pass. They're probably the most important part of the pattern, and the reason your tape had to be transparent. Remember, just snip it in about half the seam allowance. And my best tip, while I'm waiting my scissors like this, take your best tip. Oh. It never gets old. A good pun. But yeah, take your most sharp tip. It'll be not as frustrating to do it. Are you kidding me? I spent literally 2 hours. One of the pass marks didn't want to show up on the pattern, and now it's gone again. In the corner, at your own pass mark. Right on the opposite of the other pass mark. 2.4 centimeters, almost an inch from the last pass mark. Because I officially give up. When you forget one of the snips somewhere, you will realize soon enough, so don't worry too much. All you have to remember for the next step is there's only 2 different distances between the pass marks. The bigger distance corresponds to a pleat, so all the pleats on both the gusset and the handle have all the exact same width, as well as the in-between spaces with all the exact same but smaller distance. Where do you find them? Right in between. It's actually, for one time, a lot less overwhelming than it seems. As long as you do the first pleat right, you can't do the other ones wrong, really. Look for the first bigger distance between the cuts. Fold the fabric to put the cuts exactly on top of each other. You can sort of rub pleat in already a bit with your big fat sweaty thumbs.
Ew.
I find it easiest to just lay it under the foot, correctly fold it, with the needle exactly starting at the cut. Back and forth. Then I start to sort out the other side. Put the cuts on top of each other too. And make sure that on the other side the cuts are lining up as well, so that you can sew in a straight line to the other side. Taking note of which sewing guide to follow on your sewing machine will make it even easier to sew straight. So, almost perfectly. Every time you look for the next 2 cuts, put them on top of each other. This way you should get pleats that are all of the same width with a little space in between. You don't have to mark anything or pin anything. Thank me later, this will save you a lot of valuable time. Ta-da! Pleated to the guts. Insert applause. The 2 longer pieces are the handle and the shorter pieces is the gusset. Press like nobody is watching, and I'm first gonna press them to one direction, then to the other. I'm ironing them first all in opposite direction, just to be extra. Most important in the end that all the pleats are ironed towards the side of the pattern part that's slightly wider. The more it goes to the shoulder, the smaller it gets. So it's the smallest on top of the shoulder at the handle, a bit wider at where the handle is attached to the bag, and then at the bottom of the bag is the widest. All the pleats have to be turned downward. Do I make sense? Do I overcomplicating? Then I attach a layer of sort of iron-on interfacing, but this one is extra thick. It has a bit of a little foam layer behind it, which I hope will give some extra support and extra oomph. Now, so far things were going maybe a little too well, and maybe I was getting a little too enthusiastic. Is that illegal now? No, but it was actually really annoying. Okay, this actually does not stick at all. I have to iron from the other side. But that was not what I was talking about. I wanted to say probably don't reinforce the handle and only reinforce the gusset, because you'll see why. After cutting out, I'm actually removing a little of the thick layer again on all the short sides, because some of our seam allowances later are already getting really thick, even without interfacing already. And I'm gonna join the gusset halves at the wider side, aka bottom of the bag, and the handle halves at the smaller side, aka the middle of the handle. Make sure to move the pleats out of the way because we don't want to sew over them. Like always, iron open the seams carefully using the tip of your iron. So if you ironed right, which of course you did, pleats on the handle move away from the middle seam, and the pleats on the gusset move towards the middle seam. See where this is going? All the pleats from the top downward. Not really? Okay. Awkward. Next we're gonna fixate the pleats with a stitch in the seam allowance, but because I want to give the pleats some extra wiggle room in the middle to move in opposite direction, I'm gonna move the side of the pleat slightly inwards when I do this. Probably easiest to sew in the direction of the pleats. You might understand that you do not want to fold in the corners further than the 1 centimeter seam allowance. I repeat, do not fold the corners in further than the seam allowance. Now, did we have a little learning moment here? Shut up. But yeah, you already feel it coming. So, just to be sure, I would fold them in only halfway the seam allowance. And I thought I was doing this so thoroughly, even going up and down a little, fixated very well. We are getting somewhere at least. Especially on the gusset, you might want to cut the corners of the seam allowance because we're gonna get a lot of bulk there. Now the last step, where all the magic is gonna happen. I decide the middle of the pattern piece and draw a straight line with chalk on the entire piece. It's about time to let the tucks tuck. One simple but effective top stitch going in the opposite directions of the pleats is all we need to let the pleats stand up and be proud, just like daddy. Stop! Just in time. On the gusset, I want to skip the last pleat on each side for now, so that we don't run into any problems sewing it in later. Gonna have a whoop whoop, cause that's looking tucking good. Now, if you want to double check, the gusset piece should fit exactly on the gusset lining piece now, and the handle piece should fit exactly on the handle underside piece. I'm gonna use the same sort of thicker iron-on interfacing to reinforce the body of the bag. It's actually quite nice. Check the pizzazzleness here. Ooh la la. But a regular weight iron-on interfacing will do as well. Better late than never. I would recommend to cut the lining from a lining fabric, surprise, or like a thin polyester, like this funky skirt I happen to have found on the street. The round seams and the fabric is thick. They can sometimes look a little bit... how shall we call it? So I thought the solution to make it all look a lot more professional, piping.
Wow.
This step is a little bit optional. You can definitely make the bag without the pipings on the side. But in hindsight, I'm actually really glad I added it. Not that hard to do, and it really elevates the bag, giving it a certain je ne sais quoi. I play it safe this time. Make it extra long, because during the sample sewing it was actually magically getting shorter. Turns out you can buy special piping filling in the sewing store that I wisely avoid, like my mother-in-law, because it's so freaking expensive now. The store, not my mother-in-law's. Cotton macrame yarn it is. I'd recommend to not wash the bag anyway, especially not hot. There's instances that the yarns are shrinking and the piping doesn't look so striking anymore. We need 2 pipings each side of the bag. The fabric's gonna be basically double around it. We have to take 2 times the standard seam allowance, which is 2 centimeters together, plus 2 times the width of the yarn. I would definitely not take too thick of a yarn, that can start looking a little clunky. But mine was just under ½ centimeter wide. Wrapping the filling in our strip of denim, I'm gonna use these strips of fabric inside out, so it will get a little bit of a color contrast. Just gonna enclose it, but the first time around we don't have to sew exactly next to the yarn, but can be a few millimeters off of it. I switched to my zipper sewing foot to make it a little easier. Then sewing foot down, actual foot down, and full gas to the finish. Bluff is half the work here. Now here's a little surprise advantage of adding the piping to the bag, because when we attach it to the gusset first, we're actually able to check much more easily if we enclose all the tucked corners correctly. Now what I realized during my rather mediocre sample sewing is that I didn't really exactly have the right zipper foot, as it doesn't allow me to sew really close to the yarn. This is the zipper foot from my old machine, excuse the coffee stains, which literally looks like a half sewing foot, and if you have one of those, it's gonna be a lot easier to sew exactly next to the yarn. But guess what? It does not fit on my current machine. So you know what that means. If we can't avoid it, we gotta face it. Yes, I'm just using my good old regular, but boring and pedestrian sewing foot to bulldoze right over the entire thing, which made it quite a bit easier to get close to the inside yarn. And the nitpickers amongst you might see that I get a little enthusiast to enclose all the corners, so my regular seam allowance might get a tiny tad bigger. What you gonna do? Sue me?
Wow.
Now I actually don't want my piping to go all the way to the end, but stop somewhere at least before the seam allowance of the short side, because at this corner a lot of bulk is gonna come together already. Or if you're handy, you might have actually done this in one step, but I'm gonna go in with my seam ripper to get the ends a little bit loose, crop the piping and crop the filling of the piping even a little bit more, so that we can gradually work it into the seam. So I'll then reattach it at this sort of angle, letting it disappear into the seam allowance, and try to do this somewhat symmetrically on all 4 sides of the bag. Then search for the underside part of the handle, preferably not there.
Ew.
I know. Who the hell normalized that we all have these machines that suck up everything, right? Crazy.
1 pair of pants later.
You see, that did not happen. Please don't tell anyone. The underside of the handle I reinforce with my controversial, questionable spray glue and scrap fabric method. But if you have, I would use a regular iron-on interfacing like the thinner one, not a very thick or robust one. Now the handle should fit on the underside of the handle, and the notch corresponds to the middle seam. Pin the 2 parts together, good side on good side. No idea what I was talking about here, but as we know me, highly likely to be something incredibly clever. Unfortunately, the microphone wasn't microphoning. Close both long sides, and I think I'm gonna sew with the tucked side up, because there I can see the top stitch that I previously did, making sure that I really enclose all the corners in the seam allowance whilst I'm sewing, or at least that was the idea. My stitch length, for the same reason, to keep the corners really tight in the seam, I set actually quite a bit smaller than I normally would now. And now that one side is still open, I can at least check this side if everything went alright. Well, what do you think? Of course not. Corner says peekaboo, but at least it's still easy to fix now. And this is the reason I'd highly recommend to only fold in the corners to halfway the seam allowance, so you don't have this stress. Well, look who's there. Okay, let's flip this handle around. Take your safety pin through the seam. Should not be too much of a problem, because
12 seconds later.
Yo, this is why you don't use a thick, fluffy interfacing on a handle that you have to turn inside out. Who would have thought, right? When it was finally inside out, I realized I did not enclose all the corners properly, so I had to turn it back and sew again. Probably would be much easier to seam rip it open again. Oh, shut up. Why do I only think of that now? It's just too much to handle this handle. Stress depressed, but at least well pressed. That is what we want to achieve with this step. Mostly rolling the seams out a little with the fingers and then pressing the edges to flatten them. We need a zipper with plastic teeth, best to take my word on this one. A metal zipper won't be fun, is what I heard from a friend who had a situation where they could not close the bag. Terrible story. So first I found this white zipper, but oh my, look at that zipper tab.
It is so big.
And in my quest to actually make this bag a little bit of an improvement of my previous bags, I want to cover our plastic fantastic but not so pretty zipper with 2 strips of fabric in the entire length. I could literally not find the name of this. Is it even a legit thing? I don't know. I do know it's optional, especially if your sewing machine is already in retirement phase or was never even an Arnold Schwarzenegger to begin with, because it will add extra layers, so you do need some power for that. What I was getting at though is that I'm switching to this blue zipper because it has a lot smaller tab and slider, so it's not gonna interfere as much with my zipper covering. Sewing pretty close to the edge, I'm already attaching them to the zipper on both sides so that later this stitch will be hidden in the seam allowance. Most important to cover the teeth of the zipper here, even if that means the other edge isn't lining up exactly. And I didn't iron the fold in on purpose. I felt like the zipper is gonna be set in so curved it's gonna lay a little bit smoother and crack up less if it's not ironed, if that makes any sense. Now you can already zip the zipper together just to double check if it's actually looking good.
Yes.
Trying to cut the fluff all around the seams of the body of the bag as well. First gonna sew the zipper with the good side down, teeth facing down as well, to the outside of the bag. Yeah, with this curve I then decide it's probably gonna be easier to sew the zipper on without pins. Don't forget to put your zipper foot on though. Try to line up the edge of the zipper with the edge of the fabric and sew just on the normal 1 centimeter or 1 seam allowance from the edge all along the curve. Check, check, backtastic. Now sew the lining against the zipper as well. Good side down if your fabric has a good side. Now you can sew the lining and zipper in one go. I find it a bit easier to do it like this. Now I do place a couple of pins and we're sewing basically in the same way along the zipper as before. It might be a little bit of a bumpy ride because of the curve, but we will resolve that in a bit. And please do not cut corners and cut off the corner right at the zipper covers and the zipper to reduce the bulk in the seam allowance. Then along the curve of the seam allowance, I started to cut in the seam allowance, but then realized I probably get a better result just trimming down the seam allowance, which you see here. Tada, cut it in half. We love a curvy curve, but they gotta be smooth and sexy. My seam allowance might have gotten a little bit too small, so I'm melting the edges a little just to be sure that the zipper is not gonna fray out.
Did I say stand there and look stupid? No, I said burn it.
I don't think I ever switch my sewing foot that often as with this bag. But yes, it's back, the good old normal regular but boring sewing foot. To sew an edge stitch right along, you guessed it, the edge. So I'm sewing on the body of the bag, not the cover of the zipper, very close to the edge. Most important, seam allowance is folded to the left, so I'm sewing right through it. But I also want to sew through the lining itself, so that's gonna be hold down and not in the way of our zipper opening and closing.
Hot tip.
A light pull with the left hand on both the fabric and the lining will help to avoid undesired folds on the lining fabric underneath.
Wow.
Smooth stitch, no humps, bumps, and will help to keep the zipper in the direction inwards. We'll add a pocket for an insert, which is this small piece that I will hem on one of the short sides. I'm just gonna fold in 2 times, about 1 centimeter or 1 seam allowance, and close it with a top stitch. That's gonna be the opening, and it should line up with the pass mark later. And also the other still open short side to the gusset at the pass mark on the other side, good side on good side. So the pass mark is where we have our stitch line, so the edge of the fabric will actually overlap 1 centimeter or 1 seam allowance with the pass mark, so that then when we fold it to the other side and close it with a basting stitch somewhere in the seam allowance is fine for now. Matching up the end of the insert with the pass mark on the other side more or less exactly, we have created an incredibly inspiring inside pocket, which we can fill with something later to give extra body to the bag. Then we can sew the gusset line against the bag. The same pass marks that we used for the pocket are to be used here, and of course good side on good side, so that the pocket will be accessible later from inside the bag. Look at that glorious gusset. The middle seams should be lining up with the middle pass mark on the bag. Great test for the quality of your pins. in my case, it's like pinning with spaghetti, and I mean cooked spaghetti, because all my pins are bending under my finger. Best to pin the middle, then the end of the seam, and work inwards, so you'll be sure that the seams will line up well. So it's gonna be easiest to sew it on from the side of the gusset. There we can see the stitch line from the piping that we sew on, so we can follow the same stitch line again. If you have the zipper foot that looks like it's in half, you can use that. Otherwise, like me, probably you're better off using your normal sewing foot. Cut in the seam allowances all along the curves, all of them. So I think it was looking pretty good, but if you want to sew closer to the piping, I wouldn't even really open it if it's just a few millimeters. Just go closer along the piping one more time, easy peasy, and check the corners if the piping is going into the seam at more or less the same height. Otherwise, you might want to open and reclose them. The corners of the seam allowance inside the handle. Then we're gonna add it to the gusset of no.
Wait a minute.
Yes, good side on good side, of course. So one side has to line up with the seam we just sewn, and the other side is still open. So 1 centimeter seam allowance will stick out. When both sides are sewn on, it should look something like this. Now everything is gonna come together. Finally. Add the other side to the back, sewing it to the gusset in the exact same way as before. And please, 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 do not forget, was not supposed to be on camera, but eye patches, really great idea. Because did you know, sewing causes more wrinkles than smoking and sunbathing combined? Sauce? Just trust me, bro. I know. The pipings aren't that symmetrical on both sides. Just open the corner a little and close it again, preferably correctly this time. Then we can close the other side of the lining to the gusset of the lining as well. However, this time we leave a big hole in the bottom, so basically only closing the sides, so we can still turn the back inside out. Small detail that I almost forgot, the zipper tab. Don't forget to put it back on. So I'm gonna turn the back inside out. Let the back be born. Put the zip on, zip tab on. Push it back into the womb. Turn it completely back around again. Then we only still have to close the short sides. So on the side where the zipper is still open, basically trying to let the ends of the zipper meet in the middle, and just pin both sides against the gusset so that there's no gap in the middle, and the zipper ends nicely meet. But also, I'm gonna close the lining at the same time with this stitch. So I'm also gonna pin the gusset of the lining with the sides folded in similarly to the gusset of the back. Little bit of a challenge on its own, gives you a great idea of what's up next. Namely, closing all the layers together on the sewing machine. Sewing exactly over the same stitch that we used to attach the handle previously. So you should not go into the seam allowances on the side. So grab your strongest needle and your talisman. If you feel resistance, go slow, stop sewing, use the hand wheel, go a little back and go a little forward. And hopefully by the end of the seam, we all will still be alive. Close both sides super carefully, especially over the zipper. Best to just use the hand wheel and use a little bit of a bigger stitch length. Carefully. Let's get that fashion baby out of the fashion womb. Oh my god. Push, push. Just like a baby, you have to suppress the folds a little bit out of it. When they're just out of the womb, they aren't that nice. So we might give it a little steam, roll and pull the seams a little bit. Then you can close the lining just by folding in the edges and top stitching over it, or even with a hand stitch. And if you want, you can add a hard insert into the pocket, so then you distract the seam allowance from the gusset insert part and cut that shape. I had a little cardboard piece, but I would recommend to take a plastic that can bend a little. Because actually the bottom of the bag has a little bit of a rounded shape. And then, finally, we're still not finished. Gotcha. But yeah, we still have to do this one last pleat. Remember, we skipped it on the gusset. So I'm just gonna do that one with a small, subtle hand stitch. Well, guys, I don't think it's 100% perfect, but every time we do it, it gets a little bit better, I guess. The pattern will be available on my Patreon and my Etsy store. Support the channel by sewing this bag, or subscribe, like the video, share with your sewing friends. Thank you to my Patreons. Let me know if you find this interesting, if you learn something new. Leave a comment for the algorithm, leave a like, leave a kiss on the cheek, of course, gross. Anyway. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope to see you in the next one. Check out my bags playlist for more weird, crazy, and interesting bag ideas.